Alrighty, so my name is Emma Gonzalez, and I am a prevention educator at Resilience in Chicago. And today we're going to be talking about dynamics in sexual violence. So that can mean a lot of things. We'll break it down. We will talk about ways to support survivors, including young people, and then we will also talk about some resources as well. So, Resilience was formerly known as Rape Victim Advocates, and we are an independent nonprofit dedicated to the healing and empowerment of sexual assault survivors. So, we do that through non judgmental crisis intervention counseling, individual and group therapy, and medical legal advocacy in the greater Chicago metropolitan area. Resilience also provides prevention education and institutional advocacy in order to improve the treatment of sexual assault survivors. And we do that so that we can have positive change towards policies and attitudes for people that are affected by sexual violence. Whether that's survivors themselves, their loved ones, all of that. And all of our services are also free of charge. So, some of our trauma therapy services actually include art therapy. We have a journaling support group for survivors. We help people make sure that they attend their appointments as it relates to any medical help that they might need. And we are one of many rape crisis centers throughout the country. Um, yeah, and we're just one of the largest ones here in Chicago. So we partner with over 17 area hospitals. And throughout the state of Illinois, every hospital has to partner with a rape crisis center like Resilience. So that if someone goes to the hospital and that they disclose that they've experienced sexual violence, they have the right to an advocate to walk them through their legal rights and their medical rights as well. So at Resilience, we really focus on using sexual violence as an umbrella term. When we're thinking of different places, different states, even different countries, a lot of those legal definitions, while helpful, can also be really restrictive. When we use sexual violence as an umbrella term, we are acknowledging all different forms of harm that can co occur: sexual harassment, stalking, indecent exposure, voyeurism, and intimate partner violence. And it shows that all of these things can coexist at once, and that a lot of the times people will have more than one form of harm or violence that they're experiencing. And as I mentioned before, it can be really beneficial for people to understand that something didn't feel quite right in that interaction, that they felt that their boundaries were crossed, or that it reminds them of another form of harm that or violence that they've experienced. So that's why I mentioned that it can be really beneficial for people, and also acknowledging the fact that a lot of these things aren't worse than one or the other, but that they all exist because of the other ones, right? So we wouldn't have things like rape or sexual assault if it wasn't for sexual harassment, stalking, so on and so forth. That all of these things really have an interplay on one another. So that's why we use sexual violence as an umbrella term to encompass all of these forms of harm and violence. So it's really important to reflect on why we might think it's beneficial, how that might describe our experience, even if it doesn't fit these legal definitions wherever we may be in the world. We do have some current statistics. What we do know is that 1 in 5 women will experience sexual assault in their lifetime, that 1 in 10 men will also experience it. So RAINN lists it as 1 in 33 men, some even as 1 in 70 men. And RAINN stands for the Rape, Assault, and Incest National Network. So they collect a lot of data and information. However, what we do know is that based on other websites like National Center for Crime Victims and the CDC, that it can be really hard to actually get what that real number is, because sexual violence, regardless of gender, is so underreported. So we use the 1 in 10 men, because what we do know is that when we look at children, we do know that 1 in 4 girls will be sexually abused by 18, and then 1 in 6 boys will also be abused by 18. So really looking at how closely related those things are. Rates increase based on sexual orientation. So what we do know is that people that identify as bisexual, regardless of their gender, so people that like more than two genders, are the most likely to experience both intimate partner violence and domestic violence, as well as sexual violence. Rates increase based on race. So what we do know in that the United States is that Indigenous women and children are the most likely to experience sexual violence. And then Black women, Latina, Asian, so on and so forth. And then 47% of transgender people have experienced sexual assault at some point in their life. So people that change their gender throughout their lifetime. And of that 47%, 15% of people that are trans have experienced sexual violence in some sort of social service agency. So at school, at the hospital, if they are arrested, things like that. And it's really important that when we think about current statistics, where we get that information, who's not represented, how people report those things. Because as I mentioned, a lot of people don't talk about it or don't report. When we're thinking about college sexual assault or just sexual assault, sexual violence in higher education, what we do know is that 78% of male identified college students are more likely to experience sexual violence or harm than non students. And that 21% of transgender nonconforming students have been sexually assaulted, which is higher than their male or female counterparts on college settings. And that 50% of student assaults involve alcohol, so drug facilitated sexual assault. And that 90% of acquaintance rape or sexual assault involves alcohol as well. So even though a lot of people, when they think of college sexual assault, they think of just like on campus sexual assault, but a lot of these statistics and data and information comes from all different types of universities and schooling and higher education. And it also applies to schools that are predominantly commuter schools as well. When we think about the scope of the problem in sexual violence as it occurs in all of its forms, we actually think of rape culture. So, rape culture is a complex set of beliefs, behaviors, and systems that normalizes sexual violence in all of its forms. Rather than seeing sexual violence as a problem, rape culture builds this idea or this message in society that violence as it occurs sexually is the accepted way of being or the way that things are, that there's nothing that we can do to prevent it, and it's just something that we have to get used to. And what we do know, and as someone who teaches prevention, we know that that's not true, that this doesn't have to be a common experience, and that we can do things that prevent harm from occurring. So, the way that rape culture can also look is through this pyramid that I have. So, on the bottom, we have sexist, homophobic, transphobic jokes, problematic language, and objectification. Rape culture is something that we've all participated in at one point or another, and that doesn't make us bad people. But, it's really acknowledging how pervasive or common rape culture is in our society. The times where maybe we've laughed at jokes or we've watched a movie. And then when we get up to the rape culture pyramid, we have traditional roles, glass ceiling, and rigid gender based stereotypes. So it's this idea that we are encountering these jokes, media that shows sexual violence as normal or even funny. And it's starting to build this idea that, well, this is just the way that things are. That person experienced sexual violence because they did something to provoke it. It's their fault. Therefore, it's funny. When we're talking about gender roles, it's this idea that, someone asks for it. The woman was maybe doing this thing. And then we get to harassment, threats, and verbal abuse. So the first two pyramid tiers is really acknowledging how we are being socialized to view these things. And the rest of the tiers, so harassment, threats, and verbal abuse, rape, sexual assault, physical, emotional, and financial abuse, and even murder, are these ideas that we're starting to externalize it, or we're starting to behave in these ways that reinforce the ways that we've been socialized. So it's this idea that I have the right to act in this way towards someone, that because they aren't fitting these gender based stereotypes, I have the right to cause harm to them. Or they don't fit these ideas on what I think a man or a woman should be. Maybe they're non binary, so I have the right to cause harm in this way. And when we get to the top of the pyramid, which is murder, it's this idea that this person is so inferior to me that I have the right to take their life. So when we're thinking about fighting back against rape culture or addressing rape culture, it's really thinking about how it starts at that base level. What are the ways that we can interact? And of course, it's never about not watching that TV show or movie or yelling at someone because they made a joke, but how can we call each other in and have critical and important conversations around relationships, around gender, and around sexual violence? And I also have a few examples of rape culture as well. And what's really important about these is, I talk about gender reveal parties with my students. And of course, who doesn't love a party? And that's not to say that we should not be having those things, but how are we having conversations on what they're teaching us and what they're telling us about relationships, about our bodies, and about who we should be? I also have a SpongeBob joke. So SpongeBob has been on for years now, but they also have a joke about prison sexual assault and violence. And this is something that students as young as 10 or 11 can talk about and that they know what that means. So it's something that they're laughing at from this young age, but don't necessarily understand the full implications of what sexual assault in prisons actually looks like and how it occurs. The Center for Disease Control also has 5 societal risk factors when talking about sexual violence. And those things include narrow definitions of masculinity, limited roles for women and transgender nonconforming folks. So understanding that people that are non-binary or gender fluid, two-spirit, are oftentimes not included in these conversations when it comes to sexual violence. And then we have power and control. So power and control can look like a lot of things. It can be that very specific hierarchy, that boss, the way that different places are set up. Or it can also be that one friend in the group that maybe has a little bit more say than their other friends and how they actually control that environment. So, if you suggest one restaurant, but your friend is like, no, I want to go here, you're going to go to that other restaurant. So they have that control in the group. And then we have violence that's normalized. So it's thinking about violence in movies that's normalized, violence in sports, law enforcement, military, and acknowledging that it's, just considered normal. And that when one form of violence is normalized, like physical violence or racialized violence, then it often includes sexual violence as well. And then we also have privacy and silence. So it's environments or settings where privacy is a high priority. And if you speak on these things, they're going to find a way to silence you. So usually we think about family settings. So we don't talk about this in the family. We don't bring shame to the family. Universities, companies, and in a lot of different environments and places. And of course, I want to mention that just because we have these 5 risk factors, that doesn't actually mean that violence is happening. It's just something to think about and to talk about so that if we see violence happening, if someone speaks out, we can kind of understand where that's coming from or how the conditions of a place or of an environment contributed to that rape culture, if that makes sense. And then I have a few more pictures. I also have a picture of 9 to 5 with Dolly Parton. It's a great movie to, really think about just how some of these risk factors actually exist. So power and control, limited roles for women, and how violence is normalized in the workplace. So to go back onto that silence piece, one tool or way that people can be silenced is through victim blaming. So victim blaming is when the person on the receiving end of harm is held as responsible for the harm that has occurred versus the person that caused it. So when someone speaks out about violence that they've experienced, they might be asked questions such as like, why were you alone with that person? Why were you drinking? Why didn't you say something sooner? Versus understanding that sexual violence, domestic violence is a lot to go through. So it's not really about asking that person why they didn't speak out, and more so asking why did that person decide to cause harm in that way, to enact violence in that way. And here are some examples of victim blaming. So this idea that men can't get raped. Why didn't you go to the police? Well, men can't control themselves. So when we're thinking of rape culture, it's also this idea that women are always victims, men are always perpetrators. Well, why did you stay with them? Well, that outfit makes it seem like you're asking for it. And then why didn't you fight back? So just some ways that we victim blame as well, versus addressing the fact that we should live in a world without sexual violence, and there are absolutely things that we can do to challenge rape culture as well. She was moving too fast. When I mentioned that people that identify as bisexual are the most likely to experience sexual violence, this idea that they have to pick a lane, right? So it's this idea that that bisexual erasure that can also occur also contributes to sexual violence. So, when we're thinking about addressing rape culture, some questions that we can ask is how can we create an environment that is pro consent, so pro permission, that is sex positive? So, we feel comfortable setting up boundaries around sex, having conversations or not having conversations, that is removed from this normalization of rape culture. So, removed from this idea that there's nothing we can do to prevent sexual violence. And how do we think dealing with rape culture would benefit the people that we interact with? So, some of those ideas can include having conversations from an early age about consent and sexual violence, um, knowing the anatomically correct names of your private areas and private parts, specifically from a young age as well. So, there's a lot of studies that show that when children know the names of their private parts and of their private areas, that they will less likely experience sexual violence or harm because it shows that someone is talking to them about their body so that they are more likely to disclose that someone is hurting them. Other ideas of addressing rape culture would include having discussions with the people that you work with or with any student groups that you're a part of about what's okay and what's not okay behavior. So we have these community agreements, these agreements to, respect each other, to use I statements, to do X, Y, and Z, and that we're all consenting to these community agreements when we enter this space. So that's another way to address rape culture. And then another aspect of it or of addressing rape culture is also bystander intervention. So stepping in and saying or doing something when we notice that violence or harm is happening. It's also really important to acknowledge that sexual violence is both a cause and effect of oppression. So, perpetrators of sexual violence often target victims based on their identity and lack of power based on a societal level. So perpetrators usually pick victims who will less likely report and less likely be believed. So when we're talking about those statistics and that underreporting, a lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of people don't feel comfortable based on their identity and based on that power and control. So it's really asking that question, how does sexual violence look different based on identity? So race, class, ability status, or gender. And how do systems, medical or legal, erase autonomy for survivors of various identities? And how is that similar or different? When we're thinking about the founding of rape crisis centers and domestic violence shelters, it comes from a place that people were going to hospitals, they were going to law enforcement or into the criminal legal system, and they found themselves more traumatized accessing those systems than if they didn't go at all. So it's really acknowledging how those systems interact and how they either validate or invalidate someone's experience. And it's also asking that question on how we can better support young people as allies and our peers and colleagues and how that support can look different. So maybe we are someone that works with young people, maybe we are parents, maybe we are our caregivers in another way, or we have young people in our life. So it's acknowledging that there's a full spectrum of support and prevention when we're combating or addressing sexual violence, or even if we're trying to heal from sexual violence as well. And now it's really important to talk about consent. I mentioned consent earlier, but we define consent as mutual permission for an action to happen without force or pressure. And that action can mean a lot of things. So it can mean our emotional boundaries, so how we share information, it can be our personal items. And most importantly, it's those touches or those physical actions. So consent is not just with sex, but it's also how we hug people, give people kisses, how we acknowledge the boundaries of children, and all of that. So we say that consent needs to be four parts or four things. And even though we might not use legal definitions, these four things also do align with the Illinois statute, right? So it also does align with the law. So we say that consent needs to be clear, coherent, willing, and ongoing. So consent is active, it's never implied. That coherent is rational and conscious. So not under the influence of drugs or alcohol, that it's informed. When you understand what you're saying yes to, as well as having that be clear. It's also willing. So you feel comfortable saying yes or no. You want to say yes, it's enthusiastic, and you don't feel threatened into saying yes. And this is really important when we're thinking about people in abusive relationships. They might say yes, but that's not a willing yes. It's this idea that if I say yes right now, I'm going to avoid harm or violence in other ways. And consent is also ongoing. So asked every time between activities, it's checking in and it can be revoked. So consent, most importantly, is an ongoing conversation that it's allowed to change. And it's really about creating relationships with our friends, with our partners, with our family, where people can feel comfortable discussing what they're okay with and what they're not okay with. That it's allowed to change. And we're also allowed to acknowledge that, I said yes to this, but this actually didn't feel comfortable for me. So, what can we do about it? How can we have that conversation? It's also important to acknowledge substance use and consent. So, what we do know is that alcohol is the number one date rape drug. So, we're thinking about things that are considered overpouring, giving someone too much to drink, things of that nature. And then I mentioned that as well. And that when we're talking about perpetrators and oppression, that perpetrators often target people that lack power, and that substance use contributes to that lack of power in the moment. That someone is unable to exercise control and to say no in a way that they really understand. Consent needs to be clear, coherent, willing, and ongoing, and how substances really make that hard or difficult to actually achieve. And then alcohol can lower inhibition. So someone in that moment might, be feeling good. They might say yes, but then might feel differently in that morning, right? And that alcohol can also be used to cope with flashbacks and pain associated with harm. So it's acknowledging that a lot of the times these might be tools for people that are survivors to essentially to deal with trauma that they've experienced. So it's also acknowledging substances in that way. So not just when harm occurred, but how they deal with harm afterwards. And that being blackout can keep a survivor confused about the assault and that they will less likely to report. So if someone doesn't remember or they only remember bits and pieces, that they'll less likely tell someone because they're not even sure what happened, and how that can be really difficult and confusing for someone to deal with as well. And, going back to alcohol being the number one date rape drug, so only 5% of drug facilitated sexual assaults use Rohypnol or GHB. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it's also acknowledging that the culture around alcohol, drugs, and all of that is very different than maybe than what we're initially were taught about drug facilitated sexual assault. So, really that overpouring, trusting that friend that got you that drink and they maybe gave you a little bit more, or going past your limit. And, we've talked about it a little bit, but we want to define trauma as this non-pathologized definition, right? Because people can acquire trauma in various ways. But trauma is an event, so in this case, an instance of sexual harm or violence that combines feelings of fear, terror, and horror with actual or perceived lack of control. And that it can be a life-changing event that oftentimes comes with those lifelong consequences, and that it's a subjective experience that changes the brain both during that time of harm and time afterwards. So days, weeks, months, and years after that event. So it's different for everyone. As I mentioned, it's subjective. And when we think about that sexual violence wheel, that umbrella term, it's understanding that a lot of the times people will have more than one event in their life, and more than one form of harm or violence that contributes to that trauma, which is why people might have things like triggers. It's why people might be activated at certain things. And it's understanding that it's really that subjective experience. So, how are we extending that kindness to other people? How are we seeing trauma show up? And how are we also moving to a place of healing and having those honest conversations? That's also a part of addressing rape culture, is addressing trauma that we've experienced in a way that feels comfortable for us as well. And it's important to remember that there is no normal response to sexual violence. So I have done medical advocacy where I've shown up in the ER, but that tearful crying, that laughing, making threats, maybe you're sitting calmly or in denial, that lucky to be alive feeling, all of these various feelings are normal because it really depends on the hormones that are released in your brain, both during that time of harm and also that trauma that is occurring as well. So it's really important to remember that if you are a survivor, that any of these responses are totally okay and that they're normal. There is no technical normal response, but the way that you're responding is normal for you, and no one should make you feel bad about the way that you're responding. There is no perfect response. There's also a lot of barriers, as I mentioned, to disclosing that harm and that violence. So, a lot of people may not identify as a survivor or victim of sexual violence. I know I've been saying survivor this whole presentation, but different institutions, whether that is school, the medical system, the legal system, or even nonprofits like Resilience, we may use different words to describe people that experience sexual violence. However, it's really important to know that if someone doesn't identify as a victim or a survivor, that we don't have to call them terms that make them feel uncomfortable. But part of that is also understanding that they might not realize their experience is sexual violence, which is another beneficial aspect of using that umbrella term. If that didn't feel good for you, if it felt like someone was crossing your boundaries in a way, let's really talk about that. What does it feel when your boundaries are honored? What does it feel like when someone asks for your permission and your consent? People also might blame themselves. So victim blaming might be used by other people, but people can also, build up this message internally that they did something wrong. Well, maybe I shouldn't have done this, or maybe I shouldn't have worn that. Maybe I should have said something sooner. That's totally common as well. And they also may not trust the various systems and institutions that exist. So it's really acknowledging that different identities are impacted by systems negatively and are prone to systematic abuse in the medical and legal system. So when we're talking about going to the ER, a lot of the times law enforcement will be called. Maybe someone doesn't want to go to the hospital because they don't want to talk to law enforcement. When we think about survivors that might be criminalized, such as Kai Peterson, it's this idea that as a Black trans man, he didn't feel comfortable accessing the medical or legal system. And that's a really valid thing for him to feel, right? So it's this idea that some people might feel like they have no resources available to them. And additionally, people may be unaware of resources. So most people may not know of services until they're undergoing that traumatic experience or they're experiencing that flashback. Before COVID, when we would table, we had this big tablecloth that said empowering survivors and ending sexual violence. And we would get a lot of people that would disclose in that moment because it was the first time that they knew that resilience existed, that we provided those trauma therapy services for people. And people also may not want to rehash the trauma that they went through. So it can be difficult to relive and retell that experience, especially when we're talking about people that might have gaps in their memory because of the trauma that they've experienced, because they haven't talked about it in a long time. It's really that subjective experience. There are people where they can go for years without talking about it, and then something triggers or reminds them of that harm. As I mentioned, it's different for everyone. So that can also be a huge barrier to disclosure. And there can also be a lot of complex emotions. So maybe they know that person, it's someone that they're in a relationship or someone in their family, and maybe they still care about them or they care about what other people will think. And they're afraid that others will find out and what their response will be. Or, like I mentioned, they're in a relationship with that person. When we're talking about privacy and silence, is this idea that people can't know what happened in my relationship. That relationship is private to me. People have a certain idea of what that will look like. So, when we have supporting survivors, we broke it up into the don'ts and the do's and what that means. So it's really important that when you're supporting someone who discloses to you, that you give back control by letting them decide what they want to do. So do you want to tell someone else? Do you want to access trauma therapy? What does that look like for you? And that you stay calm and that you ask those open-ended questions. So carefully choosing your words and not asking why. So not going into that victim blaming behavior or pattern. And that you mirror their language. As I mentioned, it's okay if someone doesn't want to be called a survivor or victim, but you can absolutely still call out the violation that took place. Hey, I understand how you feel, but that was still not a healthy thing for that person to do. That still wasn't okay. So when we're talking about sexual violence, it's also acknowledging the fact that oftentimes it is the person that they trust or it is someone that they trust. And then we have supporting survivors, the don'ts, right? So it's important to not project or make assumptions on someone in their identity. And it's also acknowledging that we might have had our own experiences with violence ourselves. So it's important to acknowledge that when we project or assume, we're not acknowledging the autonomy of that other person, but that we're also not honoring our own stories as well. We also should not lie or promise something that you cannot guarantee, especially to a child. If a young person in your life discloses, it's really important to remember that, like I mentioned, you can't make those promises. They might ask you questions like, will my parents be mad at me? Will my teachers be mad at me? And it's important to be honest. I don't know if your parents will be mad at you, but I'm not mad at you. And it's important that we keep you safe. It's important that we also don't ask for details. We don't need to know the specifics. Studies show that when we believe people when they disclose, that it really helps them throughout their healing process later on. So it's important to remember that we don't have to press for details in that moment. It's just really important to be present with people, to believe them, to validate them, so that we can move to a place of healing and out of that trauma response. So, as I mentioned, avoid asking why. Do not victim blame. And I put don't give advice. However, I do acknowledge that sometimes we might want to share our experiences, and it might be appropriate to. Sexual violence and harm can be really difficult to experience alone. It can be very isolating. So if someone does ask if this happened to you and that feels okay, and you feel comfortable with sharing, that you do. But it's also really important to add that this worked for me, this might not work for you. And here's some other things that are good to know in terms of resources, at least in the state of Illinois. So, in the state of Illinois, we have something called the Sexual Assault Survivors Emergency Treatment Act, or SASETA. And that means anything from testing and treatment for STIs, HIV and pregnancy, treatment for injuries, that comes at no cost for the person. So it's also really helpful for people that are in abusive relationships that if they go to the hospital, that they won't receive a medical bill at home, which means that their partner won't know that they went. And that also is for the evidence collection kit. So the popular culture term is maybe rape kit, but it's also this idea that you have the right to an evidence collection kit if you go through the criminal legal system. And as I mentioned, it's no cost to that person, any treatment of those injuries, any treatment for those STIs, HIV, and pregnancy is free of charge. And it's also medical advocacy and service referrals. So let's say someone goes to the ER and they're like, you know what, I really want to work on my addiction or substance use. This is really important to me, or I need help with housing. That's also that service referral as well that they can access in the ER or at any rape crisis center as well. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Resilience partners with over 17 hospitals throughout Chicago in the Chicagoland area. Other things that are helpful to know is that we also have protective orders, which also can be known as a restraining order. So we have a civil no contact order or an order of protection. So you don't have to be in an ongoing abusive relationship to actually access one of these things, and that you can also access them without a police report. So we do have 555 Harrison here, which is the domestic violence courthouse as well, where people can be paired with an advocate that will help them through that process of a protective restraining order type of thing if that's what they request, right? So you also have the right to a police report at any age and a right to an evidence collection kit. And then we also have something called crime victims compensation. So it's this idea that being a survivor can be really expensive and it can require time off of work if you're in an abusive relationship, time to move out, go to therapy, court dates for that protective order, whatever it may be. So crime victims compensation is through the state, and it means that you can actually access money and funds that help with that time off of work or with therapy or with any other medical expenses. We also have the Victim Economic Safety and Security Act, which means that it is illegal to be fired from your job for experiencing sexual harm or violence. That with a doctor's note or with a note from a rape crisis center or a domestic violence shelter, that can be supplied to your workplace. And by law, your workplace cannot fire you. And that you also have a certain amount of days off by law as well. And this also includes for people that are considered domestic workers. So people that are nannies, people that are freelancers, things of that nature, so that you can't be fired or have that contract nullified by experiencing harm or violence. We also have the Safe Homes Act, which means that you have the right to break your lease, whether that is written or oral. So even if you don't have a written lease, you can still by law break that contract. You also have the right to change your locks within 24 hours. So if you don't want to leave your home, you don't have to leave your home. You can have your locks changed, or you can have a new lease written up. And then we also have Title IX laws, so laws that protect students when they experience sexual violence or harm. And just some reminders on working with young people. So, if we have young people in our life, it's really important to remind them about the age of consent. So, in the state of Illinois, that's 17 years old. And it's always important to support how the young person identifies as and how they feel about their experience. It's also important to reserve judgment and reflect on your own feelings about young people. It can be hard to work with young people and acknowledge that they have their own life and relationships, even though we want to acknowledge that they're minors and children. And it's also about normalizing consent and making it a conversation so that we can address that rape culture. And how are we having these conversations around consent and healthy sexuality, not only with each other, but with young people in our life? So, using words and vocabulary that is age appropriate and developmentally appropriate. So, a good rule for that is if they're old enough to use that word and they're using that word or they're asking questions about it, that we can find a way to maybe define it for them and have that conversation. And when we are in different positions, when we're working in the medical field, social service, educational, that we also check in with our employer around mandated reporting and what that looks like. And how can we make sure that we are centering young people when they're experiencing harm. Hospitals must provide survivors with the necessary medications of anyone at any age so that they can consent both to treatment and evidence collection. However, you need to be 13 years or older to release that kit for testing. So if you do go in for that evidence collection kit and you do want to go the criminal legal route, you do need to be 13 years or older for that. However, you can be at any age to consent for that. So a little bit more about me. Here is my email. So egonzalez at ourresilience.org. Our free services include medical and legal advocacy, individual and group counseling. So we do have those support groups. We also have dance movement therapy. We have different forms of art therapy. We also do that prevention education. So working with anyone at any age that wants to know more about this topic and talk more about it. And then we also have a downtown Michigan Avenue office for people to access those therapy resources as well. And we also have our number. So even if you don't go to the ER, but you want a resource referral, you can still call that number. Additionally, we have other hotlines, and I'll put the number up on there, including the domestic violence hotline, that are multilingual. So the domestic violence hotline here in Chicago has over 140 languages and has access to 170 local resources to address domestic violence. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to do a new share. I'm going to pause. Oh, me. Just so I can put the number up on the board. But this is what the website looks like, and this is what the number looks like for the domestic violence hotline. So for information, options, counseling, legal, and shelter resources and services, toll free, 24 hours, confidential, and multilingual. And that number is 877 863 6338. So just to repeat that one more time, it's 877 863 6338. And of course, you can also call as a family or friend as well. So if you want to ask questions on behalf of someone else, that's always a good idea to do. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you learned something, heard something in a new way, or have some ideas on a better way to access resources for yourself or to address rape culture and show up for your community. Thank you so much.